Recording. Well, good evening, everyone. This is Reverend Sherry L. Jackson in Alexandria, Louisiana. And tonight we are continuing our study in the book of Exodus. And we will talk about the Passover as instructed in Exodus 12. But as Christians, we will talk about how Christ is in the Passover, but at the same time instituted a new thing called the Lord's Supper, which we call it the Lord's Supper, communion, or the Eucharist. And he did that in the upper room on the Thursday night before crucifixion. So again, we've always said that you can't study the New Testament unless you study the Old Testament. And so tonight we are going to deal with Christ in the Passover. So let's go back a little bit and get some background. And we're talking about Christ, but we got to do it in relationship to the Old Testament. And if you've read, you know that the Old Testament tells us about the Passover. It was a feast that celebrates and remembers God's liberation of Israel from Egypt. And we talked about that last week with the 10th plague, and the 10th plague was the plague of the death of the firstborn. And remember, we talked about the blood being put on the doorpost, and when God saw the blood over the doorpost, it was a sign that all was well, and that family, that household, had been obedient to the instructions that were given. And so when God saw the post that had the blood on it, the death angel passed over that house. And so until this day, the Jewish faith remembers this time. Remember, Exodus is a book of rescue. It is a book of salvation. It is a book that talks about bringing out. And so you will know that we also talk about salvation and bringing out and rescuing. And so what Moses did for the Israelites, Christ did for us. And all of this takes place after Joseph saved Egypt from starvation, and the Israelites lived in Egypt as guests. And we remember that whole story of how the Israelites, they were the Hebrews at that time. They just multiplied, and the Egyptians said that, look, we got to do something about them because they're going to overtake us if we don't. So eventually the Egyptians forgot about Joseph and enslaved the Israelites for hundreds of years. This is just a little review. Overburdened with work and mistreatment, the Israelites suffered great deal, and they called out to the Lord. And that's a phrase that we really didn't talk about a lot, but it said, the scripture said in Exodus, when God heard their cry, he moved. Now that's something to shout about right there. When God heard their cry, he moved. Isn't that good to know that when we cry out to God, he will hear? And hear is not just sound, we're receiving sound with our ear, but that word hear means he heard with the intention to do something about. He heard with the intention to do something about. And so when God heard their cry, he moved into action. God responded to their cry and raised up a great leader. Then that leader was Moses, who challenged Pharaoh and Egypt's power. The book of Exodus explains how God freed his people from Egypt. That's what the book is about. It is about how God took his people. And remember, let's go back all the way back to Abraham. This is just a continuation of Abraham's story. These are the people that will become a nation that God promised Abraham. Right now, they hadn't really been formed into a nation. They just kind of like a bunch of people, a bunch of Hebrews, so to speak. And God is going to fashion them. He is going to make them a nation. Now, that's some preaching right there. We are not who God have called us to be when he called us, or he gives us the promise. However, he fashions us to be that. So it doesn't matter how we come to the table. God is going to make us into the people he wants us to be. And because of the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, God punished Egypt with the 10 plagues, and we went over that, Exodus 7 through 11. Instead of recognizing the true God of heaven and earth, Pharaoh grew angrier, and angrier. Pharaoh just would not let the people go. He still thought that he was God. In fact, he was known as called a god. He was the deity of, he considered himself a god. And just think, Moses is coming talking about God say, let my people go. Well, Pharaoh himself thinks he is the God. And remember the pantheon of God, the 8 major gods that they had. And so God, Yahweh, is saying, let my people go. Let my people go. Okay, Pastor Green, are you on? Okay. So one way Pharaoh increased the Israelites' suffering was by refusing to give them straw, one of the key materials to produce bricks. So he made their work hard by not giving them the tools that they needed to do the work. And that's just like if anybody working, you know, sometimes they can make it hard. They give you a task, but not give you the necessary tools to get the job done. Yes, sir.
Am I in?
Yes, sir.
Okay, one of the things I thank you for pointing out to us is that when people fail to remember or study their history, they fail. And so the Egyptians did not keep up with their history to know that Joseph had been the person who had protected and saved the nation. And so there come up a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, didn't know his history. And they thought by inflicting pain and suffering on the Hebrews that it would diminish them. I don't know why they thought that Pharaoh's family planning didn't take them out. The beating them didn't take them out. The improper food didn't take them out. It's almost like a people live in America who live off substandard budget and died and always ate what other people threw away, but somehow God sustained them, and we just keep going. But I hope and pray that as we go through this lesson, that we remember that this was a physical deliverance, that this deliverance from Egypt was physical. It was not spiritual. So sometimes we try to connect the two, but there are many forms of salvation, and this one just happened to be physical deliverance, where God allowed Abraham's descendants to walk out of the land into the land of promise that he had told Abraham over 400 years ago. And we keep our history in front of us, the current events make a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And one of the things, like I said, that this is the time for the Passover that the Jewish faith has, is something that they take very seriously. They only have the physical salvation, which is the bringing out of Egypt that God instructed them to remember, which when we get to the New Testament, Christ is going to tell us to remember, to do this as often as. And so this Passover comes once a year, and it's a very detailed celebration. And we're going to talk a little bit. I hope you had an opportunity to look at the video that gave the instruction of the Passover meal. So even though Pharaoh did not want to let the people go, he would tell them, go ahead on and leave. And then he would bring them, say no. Then he said, okay, you can go, but leave the animals. And he never would. So God said, all right, I'm going to do something that's going to take all of the gods out. All of the gods out. And that was the tenth plague. So as the plagues continued, the suffering shifted from the Israelites to the Egyptians. The nation paid dearly for Pharaoh's stubbornness. During the last plague, God killed all of the firstborns in the land of Egypt, including Pharaoh's own son. And that's when things got started to change. Remember, we talked about we usually don't move unless it happens to us. When it hits our house, it's always those people they should do this or that, or I wouldn't do if I was them. And then when it hits our house, then we want everything to shut down. We want the cavalry to come to our rescue. Because remember, we talked about if Pharaoh's son taken out, that means that his lineage was cut off. And to cut off his lineage would cut off the deity or the gods who they thought they were. So God gave his people a way to escape the destruction. The blood of a perfect lamb could take the place of the firstborn in the family. Okay, so remember we talked about that if your household didn't have a lamb, then you could share with another family. It was an individual thing, but it also was a national thing. It was an individual thing, but it's also a national thing. It was a community thing. Now, let's just remember that when we do the Lord's Supper, when we do communion, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, as we call it in the Baptist church, so to speak, we are to do it in communion. We do it as a nation. We do it as brothers and sisters. Okay, we share in this together. So God gave them some specific instructions that they were to follow that night. And the whole thing was God gave them instructions to follow, and that if they were going to escape the punishment, the blood of this lamb must be on their doorposts. And remember, we talked about the significance because there was no altar, but the door symbolized the entry into the home, the entry. Remember, we have our heart today. The blood covers our heart. When God sees the blood of the lamb, which is the blood of his son, then he knows that we belong to him. And so symbolically, that's what that blood over that doorpost suggested, that each person or each family that had that, God said, okay, this person, this household belongs to me. They have followed my instructions. And remember, up until now, all that the Israelites had to do was stand back and watch. They did not have to be active participants. However, this time they had to become active participants. It was something that they were going to have to do. And they were going to have to believe and obey the instructions that God has given them for their physical salvation. Now, can't you see how that correlates with us? We're going to have to be obedient to accept the instructions that comes with receiving our salvation. Not a physical salvation for us, but a spiritual salvation. So, yes, all we have to do is believe and receive, but the Israelites, for their physical, were going to have to actually manually put the blood over the doorpost. It was really the first time that God had wanted to see if they would obey him. And there were consequences for not. Any questions or comments at this time? Okay. Linda McKinney. Linda?
Yes, Sherry.
Okay, would you care to elaborate a little bit for me? Just talking about the where we are so far and how this correlates, how you see it correlating with the New Testament and what it is that we believe about the Lamb, the importance of the Lamb.
The correlation that I would draw is that as Jesus, is the sacrificial lamb for us, but he is the fulfillment of what was doing here. Mm-hmm. If we had to slay a lamb, each family, and bring it to the altar, you would just think of what that would be like today in our churches or in our worship service. But Jesus is that sacrificial lamb now, and we just accept it by faith.
That's right. And as we continue to move on in this chapter, we're going to see the instruction that God gave to them, that it was going to be some specific instruction that he was going to give. And that was for a purpose. So thank you so much, Linda, for that. So God gave his people a way to escape the destruction. The blood of a perfect lamb could take the place of a firstborn family. And so the idea of a perfect lamb is that there could, we said real flippant, kind of like today, a lamb without spot or blemish, a lamb without wrinkle, because God wanted a perfect sacrifice. And so this animal could not have any marks, any blemishes, couldn't have any broke legs. Everything had to be whole. It had to be as perfect could be at this time. And so when we correlate it with Christ, as Linda said, Christ is the perfect sacrifice. No spots, no blemish, no sin, no darkness. And so God was the only person who fit that bill. God the Father replicated himself or wrapped himself in flesh to come as the Son. In other words, the only person who could do this job was God himself. And so God came in the flesh to become the perfect sacrifice. So as we continue on, we've talked about what was going to take place with this final plague, and the whole thing is, after all of this, they get out. They end up with what God instructed, a 7-day feast, and a meal or a big banquet or something to symbolize this, or to observe this coming out, was the Seder meal. Okay? And it ended up at they do it now, it's kind of like a whole 7-day celebration. And so we're going to talk about this. Now remember, when we come to the table being the Lord's Supper, that's kind of like our Passover meal, so to speak. But in the upper room, Jesus changed it to become the Lord's Supper. We're doing it in remembrance of him, as opposed to remembering being brought out of Egypt. Okay, we together? If you have a question, please send it by chat or ask it out loud. Okay, so now, when is this celebrated? It is the 10th day of the month. Now, I have to disclose that I never quite understood the different calendar year that the Jewish festivals and holidays fall on. I have not spent a whole lot of time with that, but it is different than the calendar that we use, which came from the Romans. So, but when God gave them these instructions, they were to celebrate it the 10th day of the month. They were to choose an unblemished lamb, a male sheep or goat. Remember, an unblemished lamb. Now remember now that it was not a new thing for them to sacrifice animals. Even with the other deities, there was still some type of sacrificing animals. But to separate these sacrifices from anything else, God gave them specific instructions. So they were to get an unblemished lamb, a male sheep or goat. All of the congregation of the Israelites slaughtered the lamb at midnight. They put the blood on the doorpost. They ate the flesh that night, roasted over fire, along with unleavened bread, matzah, and bitter herbs, marah. They were to eat and to prepare in such a way that they had to, if they had to leave at a moment's notice, and they did have to leave at a moment's notice. That's why we have this unleavened bread, because they were not going to have time to for the yeast to do what the yeast needed to do. So they were going to eat prepared to leave at a moment's notice, and they were going to eat during the night of the final plague. So we can see how all of this is playing out. So they have unleavened bread. What do we have during communion, the Lord's Supper? We have unleavened bread. Now, of course, we've modified, and very few people make homemade bread for this, especially if your congregation is large size. But most of the times we're going to have something that is going to be some type of cracker, or something that's going to be with no yeast in it. In other words, we're not trying to come to get filled up. The idea is to commemorate and remember what took place. Now, for us, is what took place on Calvary. For the Jews, is what took place coming out of Egypt. Okay, coming out of Egypt. So again, hopefully you've had a chance to look at the video, and you could see the whole meal and what everything means. Now, it said, okay, so we said that they had bitter herbs. I'm wondering why. What does this bitter herbs? Remember, slavery was not a kumbaya situation. Slavery was harsh. So the bitter herbs were a representative or a symbol of the harshness of slavery. So God wanted to keep this in their mind of where they had come from. And so when they ate of the bitter herbs, which would have been something like romaine lettuce, horseradish, and we have this picture here. If today, just think about some greens or veggies that we eat, chard or kale, that's not that's bitter. And so using these herbs was a representation of the harshness of slavery. Was a representation of the harshness of slavery. So the idea was not to have a banquet and everybody feel good and eat to be full, but it is a remembrance of where God had brought them. So when we have communion, the Lord's Supper, it is not a time of conversation. It is a time of remembrance. Now, there is a celebratory atmosphere to it, but a lot of times, we don't reverence it as much as we should. And maybe that's because, something that we do all the time, we forget what the real meaning is. But when he instructed them to make sure that they had bitter herbs, it was to remember the harshness of slavery. Okay, any questions up until this point?
I have one.
Yes, ma'am.
Regarding putting the blood on the doorpost. It said doorpost and lintel. What is the lintel?
Anybody that want to explain lentil green? For me, it's the doorpost, the frame,
The outer
the
part.
framing, the doorpost, the frame.
Okay.
That's what because remember last week we said it could not be on the floor of it because nobody could touch it or walk on it or trample on it. So it had to be up top.
Okay.
Okay. I think Pastor Green.
Yeah, I was trying to say, am I coming through?
Yes, sir.
Hello? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
As you mentioned earlier, the doorposts are either side of the door frame, and if you notice on most of houses or tents, whatever you go in, over the top, there is this mantle, a board, or frame where this blood is put over, and we went under. Those who walked through the door was protected behind the blood of the lamb that was on the doorpost and the mantle. And as long as they stayed inside, the death angel, wherever the blood was, passed over. The blood of the lamb protected them, and it's the blood of the lamb that protects us. Now, ours is spiritual salvation, and that was a physical salvation. And those who did not have the blood on their doorpost and mantle and was not behind it, inside, even if you were a Hebrew and you disobeyed the instructions, your firstborn died. So it was a death cry all over the land. And Passover simply means that the death angel passed over the house where they were protected by the blood of the Lamb.
Thank you so much. Okay, if you're on, I'm trying to make sure I got everybody on mute. Okay, so now we have we got the bitter herbs. So also with the bitter herbs was the unleavened bread. And it said that this was probably similar to pita bread. And it also was a part of, they would have understood this already as being a part of sacrifices that they had, that they were doing before. They made haste of their departures, which left no time to bake the leavened bread. The week-long abstinence from unleavened bread was a reminder of how God had so overwhelmed the Egyptians that they drove the Israelites from Egypt to their freedom. And so when we also, another symbol of unleavened bread is the bread of affliction. In other words, it symbolized how harsh again slavery was. It's also called the bread of mourning, the bread of the poor, the manna from heaven. So again, this is something that has transferred over into our observance, which is again a reminder of the salvation that we have. So when the Jews participate in the Passover, it is about remembering their deliverance from Egypt. When we celebrate, and we say celebrate the Lord's Supper, observe the Lord's Supper, it is about how God has delivered us from the slavery or the bondage of sin. So also in this Passover meal, which has kind of like been added over time, is parsley or green herbs, which represent springtime and renewal of hope. partially dipped in salt water, which represent tears of slavery. They also had haricot, which is a mixture of apples, raisins, lemon, and cinnamon, represents the mortar used to build Pharaoh's buildings. Roasted egg, which represents the triumph of life over death. And there were 4 cups of wine, which recall the 4 terms of redemption in Exodus 6 through 8, where 4 times God talked about bringing them out. He said, I will free you, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, I will take you to be my people. So they drink 4 cups of wine to commemorate God saying that he was going to deliver them. And the drinking of wine in Israel and among the Jews is a very, I would use the term religious thing. When I was in Israel, wine represented life. And so there was wine throughout the day with all the meals. It was more of a, for lack of a better word, it was more of an spiritual experience. So it was almost like when we drink coffee among friends or we drink tea among friends, they drink wine. It's a part of the fellowship and a part of the remembering. Okay, any questions or comments? Okay. So again, the Torah commands the story of Exodus be recounted to the children. And so remember, the word Torah is the Jewish word for the law, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And especially Exodus, they are commanded to tell the story to the children. And so if you go to a Seder meal, this story of deliverance, the Exodus story, will be told. The Jewish faith, again, is all about remembering. It's all about remembering. And so at the meal, they're going to tell of the story of God delivering their people from slavery. The Passover feast came to be called the Seder meal. And since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, there have been no more sacrificial lambs. There is, unless you got some Orthodox, there's not going to be any sacrificial lambs. The temple, what I'm talking about, is the temple of Jerusalem that was destroyed in 70 AD. And so there is no sacrifices. And I remember being in Israel, the hope is that when the temple is restored, which they call the third temple, that they will begin sacrificing again. But because there is no temple, there is no sacrifices at this time. But what they do is have a roasted shank bone, which is displayed as a symbol of the sacrificial lamb. Okay. So there is a particular service for the Passover meal. So just think about the ritual that we have, or the liturgy that we have around the Lord's Supper. That there is a method to it. There is a order to it. And so the Passover meal is, you got the first cup of wine, dip the green in salt water. You eat your matzah or your unleavened bread. You eat your marrow, which is your bitter herbs. And you tell the story of Exodus. You have your second cup of wine. You have dinner. Then there's the blessing after the meal, the third cup of wine, the psalms and songs, the conclusion, and the fourth cup of wine. And so there is a method to the service. Now, some Passover meals are closed just for the family, just for the Jewish community, and then there are some that are open. I don't remember if it's like one night is open of it or how that works. So if any of you guys have ever gone to participated in a Passover meal and could share, that would certainly be helpful. Pastor Barbara, I see you on the line. Did I recall you going to a Passover meal?
No, I have not.
Okay.
I was invited, but I was not able to attend.
Okay. Okay. Has anyone else been to a Passover meal? Okay. Well, we owe it to ourselves to try to do that. You don't have to be afraid because it is of another faith. The Joyce Green Leadership Institute, we went over to the temple a month or so ago to participate in one of their Day of Atonement, the day that they do once a year to, it's kind of like the beginning of their new year. And you will find, of course, you're not going to hear Jesus because they don't worship Jesus, so to speak, but you would be able to pick out pieces that you can relate to. So again, this is the order of service. There is an opening prayer. And the prayer basically says, this is the bread of affliction, the poor bread, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are in want share in this Passover. Now we celebrate here, next year in the land of Israel. Now we are still slaves. Next year, may we all be free. Now, of course, all of these are things that have evolved over this time, just like everything else, how we've adapted to modern times. But this is a prayer that would be said to open up the Passover meal. So how do we get, now that we get to Jesus, where do we see the Passover at as we get closer toward the New Testament, or in the New Testament? King Josiah moved Passover celebration to the temple in Jerusalem. So it had been celebrated in homes and things of that nature, but King Josiah, when he took over in the 6th century, the big Passover celebration was taken to the temple in Jerusalem. Now, remember, I just told you that the temple had been destroyed, and so therefore there is no Passover celebration there. And also, there on the site of the temple site, so to speak, the Jews do not own that site. The Muslims own the site now. You will see it's called the Dome of the Rock. There's this gold dome that, and the site belongs to the Muslims. So the Jews are not even in control of the temple site. And so there's strife between the Jews and the Muslims because the Jews say that that's their site. and they look for a day when they can take control of that site again in order for them to rebuild the temple. And again, they call that the third, they will call that the third temple. Lambs were cooked outdoors in open places in the city, meals eaten in rented rooms where people recline at a table in Roman fashion. Now, you will know that this was not anybody who could do this. This were well-to-do people would have been able to actually celebrate Passover in the actual temple. Now, there were lots of people who were there, but not everybody was going to be able to rent rooms to go into the temple to actually have the Passover. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, all tell the story of the Passover meal that Jesus had, and that's when it became called the Last Supper. John talks about Jesus crucified on the day Passover lambs were sacrificed at the temple. So therefore, the Last Supper became the meal before Passover. So let's get this. Jesus was crucified on the day Passover lambs were sacrificed at the temple. Can you see the correlation? Jesus was crucified, became our Passover lamb that was sacrificed at the temple. The Eucharist, and you'll see me interchaining Eucharist, some denominations like the Roman Catholics, Methodists, Anglicans, they will call this meal the Eucharist, and we call it the Last Supper. And this is a time that we remember God's great redemptive sacrifice at Calvary at this meal. Pastor Green.
Yeah, it is also referred to as the Thanksgiving meal, where we can all give thanks to God for his sacrifice. I'm glad you pointed out that in Luke's gospel, you look at the synoptic gospel, Luke plainly tells them, what day it is. Mark tells what day it is, on the 14th day of Nisan. As they look at the calendar, as they prepare themselves to march out in haste, and as the gospel tells the story, Jesus' disciples asked him, where do you want us to prepare for the Passover meal? And he gives them instructions about going into the city and finding the person with a pitcher of water. And they all end up in the upper room, as you pointed out. And during the course of the meal, as they were eating and drinking on that fourth cup of wine, and that is where we find the institution of the Thanksgiving meal, the Lord's Supper, or Eucharist, saying how his desires to eat with them, to be with them. But he given them a new thing. We call it the cup of redemption. We call it the blood of the Lamb. He said, this is my blood that is shed for you. So he's telling them the day before what's going to happen on the day afterwards. And you're absolutely right. As John points out, that he was crucified on the day of the sacrificial lamb was to be slaughtered. And it was the time in the evening when he actually died, at that ninth hour or 3 o'clock is when the lamb was to be slaughtered, even though in Egypt it was at twilight. But by the time it gets to Jesus and reenacting that, it was at the time of the evening sacrifice. And he instituted it the day before. And he went to Calvary. And all of us who accept him as our Lord and Savior are thankful, just like I'm sure all the Hebrews were thankful that they stayed behind and let the Lord to protect them. So there is a parallel if we look at it, and we can see a prototype of Christ in Exodus.
Okay, thank you so much. And so as he talks about that parallel, let's just take a look right here, Old and New. In the Old Testament, it's called the Passover feast, as we've talked about. And in the New Testament, we have the Lord's Supper. And so it's the old and the new, but it has the same feel to it. The purpose is the same, that to celebrate deliverance, to celebrate freedom. So it can also be called a freedom meal, or something that helps us to remember our freedom that we have in Christ. So when we get to Matthew 26 through 27, this is a something that we read during communion time, during the Lord's Supper. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it. What kind of bread would it have been? It would have been the unleavened bread. And gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup. What cup was it? It was a cup of wine. And gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." So here, Jesus institutes or changes the meaning of this gathering, this eating. So they would have been, based on what we've already studied, that they would have been eating already unleavened bread, and they would have been drinking the wine. Okay, so again, in the old, we can see the Passover from Exodus 12 and 13, where that phrase says, "I will pass over you." And then when you get over to the Lord's Supper, even in Luke 22 and 15, he says, "With fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." So Jesus, as a Jew, would have been observing the Passover. It's the same Passover that's in Exodus 12 and 13. It's the same Passover, but the meaning is changed because Christ is the Lamb. Christ is the sacrifice. So they would no longer have to celebrate like they did in Exodus, but because Christ is now among them rather. So again, this lamb, the Passover lamb, should be without blemish, a male of first year, a very young lamb. You may take it from the sheep or from the goat. Now, when we get over to the New Testament, or this new feast of the Lord's Supper, it says what? "But with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish, without spot, without sin, without any broken bones." I hope you see the parallel between the Passover sacrifice and the Lord's Supper sacrifice. A lamb without spot or blemish. So the next time that we celebrate, commemorate, or observe the Lord's Supper, think about what you're actually doing. That this tradition or this supper that we are engaging in was something that Christ even engaged in. he engaged as the Passover, but he changed it and instituted it in such a way that it became a new thing. And we celebrate it as the Lord's Supper. Okay, again, the blood. Remember, it's all about the blood. So in the Old Testament, the old feast in Exodus 12, they would have put blood over the doorpost. And all houses that had blood over the doorpost, and God had instructed, the household was going to be saved. And so when we get to the New Testament, we get to the Lord's Supper, it is still by the blood of Christ. You cannot get past the blood. It's all about the blood. And remember, blood is a life-saving agent. Blood is a life-saving agent in the physical as well as the spiritual. So also there will be no leaven. And as we understand from the Old Testament or from Exodus, they had to leave in haste. And so they could not bake the bread. And so when we get to the New Testament or to the Lord's Supper, we still keep the feast. And he said, not with old leaven, but with, which thinking about what they would have done in Exodus, but we still keep the feast with unleavened bread. And at the end of the day, it is, whether it's the Passover or the Lord's Supper, it is a memorial. In Exodus, God told them, you do this for a memorial and do it for a reminder to all generations after this. And so when we get over to the Lord's Supper, in Luke, Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. Do this in remembrance of me. It's the same. It's the same concept, the same. We come to the table, the same reverence as the Jews would come to the Passover meal with. It's all about remembrance. And so at the end of the day, this table is the centerpiece of the majority of our churches, because it symbolizes the work that Christ did for us, the sacrificial lamb. So I know a lot of modern churches and new churches are not putting these pieces in their churches, or they put them in and make them mobile where you can move them in and out. But we keep it at the center because that's where our mind should be on. Whether or not we are actively taking the Lord's Supper or not, when we look at this table, we are remembering, it ought to conjure up the work that Christ did for us. And it said, as often as you do this, whenever that you do it in remembrance of me.